The Fed is deeply worried about a very deep recession. Worries about a deep recession drove Federal Reserve policymakers to slash another interest rate last month. Even as the Fed battled in almost unprecedented fashion to stem a widening credit and housing slump, some members worried over the possibility of a prolonged and severe economic downturn. And it was in that environment that they voted with 2 dissents to cut its most important interest rate by 3/4 of a percentage point to 2.25%. That action capped the most aggressive Fed intervention in at least a quarter century. Some Fed policymakers thought that such a widening recession could not be ruled out given the further restriction of credit availability and ongoing weakness in the housing market. With the uncertainties and the outlook for both economic activity and inflation elevated, members have noted that appropriately calibrating the stance of interest rate policy is becoming very difficult. On the one hand, the Federal Reserve has been urgently moving to prevent the trio of economic woes, housing, credit, and financial, from plunging the country into a very deep recession, perhaps a depression. Well, it's coming too. On the other hand, with soaring energy prices and high food costs, policymakers realize that they can't afford to let inflation get out of control either, even though it's starting to also. Even with the big interest rate reduction in March, most Fed members saw overall inflation moderating in the coming quarters, hopefully. However, inflation pressures had picked up even as economic growth had weakened, suggesting that uncertainty clouded the inflation outlook also. There is concern that inflation expectations could potentially become unhinged. If people, investors, and businesses expect prices to rise sharply, they'll act in ways that will make inflation worse. Once inflation takes hold, it is very hard or difficult to break. Since last September, the Fed has been cutting rates to shore up the economy. One of the risks of lowering rates is that it can sow the seeds of inflation down the road. To battle inflation, the Fed usually boosts rates. Against this backdrop, Bernanke, in a congressional appearance last week, didn't tip his hand about the Fed's next move on interest rates. Anyway, the government reported last week that the economy lost jobs for the 3rd month in a row in March. All told, the nation has lost at least 232,000 jobs in just 3 months. Stark evidence of just how much the employment market has weakened under the weight of the economy's woes. And for the first time, Bernanke last week acknowledged that a recession is now quite possible. The Fed has found itself fighting a vicious cycle where credit problems hurt the economy's outlook, which in turn worsens credit problems. There is evidence that an adverse feedback loop was underway, or is underway. Well, actually it's more than that. Yes, a whole lot more. Besides cutting rates, the Fed has taken a number of unconventional steps recently to ease a very dangerous credit crisis. separately in the broadest use of its lending authority since the 1930s. Remember what happened in the 1930s? Yes, the Great Depression. The Fed last month agreed to temporarily let investment firms obtain emergency financing from the Fed, a privilege that previously had been granted only to commercial banks. Anyway, there's more to this, and it is the war on terrorism, the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, is connected to the downturn in the economy. There is a connection. Yes, it's definitely connected. The longer we're there, the worse the economy gets. And no, the Iraq war, there's no good coming out of it. Not that way, at least. It is the beginning, or the beginnings, of Armageddon. And these are more end times, last day signs, whatever you want to call it. And there are many.